My stepdad moved his freeloading daughter into my house and changed the locks while I was away on a business trip. When I told them I was hiring a lawyer to sue, my mom hit me with a vase, calling me a traitor. However, in court a surprise was revealed that even my mom, without informing me, my stepfather, Dan, relocated his adult daughter into the house where I grew up. Then while I was at work, he packed my things, grabbed my bag, changed the locks, and locked me out of the house. In addition, my mom is supporting him. She doesn't care if she irritates him. Despite my best efforts, I was unable to establish a cordial relationship with him. In this house, I've always felt burdensome and inferior. I have remained mute for the many years he has lived in this house, but he has consistently put me to the test. I can't take it this time. There is some time owing to the time difference because my mother would call me as soon as she wakes up. I'm willing to fight back even if I can avoid giving her a deadline. Even though she has caused me to feel guilty throughout the years, I will not give in to her attempts to put me in touch with the wrong people. Dan is clearly unpleasant and conceited. How is it possible for him to bring his daughter into my house without my consent? It must appear ridiculous to you just as it does to me. 2 weeks ago, I informed Dan that his 23-year-old daughter, who is an adult with a job, did not have to live with us. For a long time, though, she stayed as though she had moved in. Dan claimed she needed time with him and that she was merely a visitor. Therefore, she was exempt from paying when I suggested that she split the expenses with me. He said I was merely jealous. I wanted to dispute, but I decided to keep my inner peace and be quiet for the sake of the family's harmony. But after that, the topic changed to what are known as privacy concerns. Unbelievably, Dan's daughter insisted on having her privacy protected. This is not her home. It is my parents'. She was on a video call and became irate as I walked into the living room. She should utilize a different room rather than the common living area if it's a private call. Dan came into the living room as she stormed out. I bemoaned her obvious harshness to him. I was uneasy about her staying at home, so I proposed that we only get together when I'm not home or when she's not. He lost his temper and accused me of being unappreciative. He claimed that my lack of consideration was the reason of my problems with my father. I was shocked by his boldness. Why did he bring up my father? I wonder. What she did to me, I did to his daughter. I shared his words with my mother, but I didn't think I could count on her support. My mother urged that we both apologize, claiming that I was misinterpreting Dan. I kept ignoring him and wouldn't apologize to him. When my mother returned home last week, I intended to make them make a decision. Either they go or I do. I was raised in this house which belonged to my father, but I had to make certain choices because of Dan's most heinous acts. My things were packed when I got home, and there was a letter in one of the suitcases. Dan's handwriting appeared on it. There was no other option, the message said. He had had enough of my demeanor. He chose to expel me because he did not want to choose between me and his daughter. The speed at which our relationship has evolved saddens me. He was an excellent man who did his best to be a father figure to me when he first married my mother. We had a great relationship, and if I had any issues, I could talk to him about anything. One day, when his daughter came to our house and told me she had moved to town and wanted to spend more time with her father, I was emotional. I was excited to have a new sister. I was happy to welcome her and try to make her feel like we were real sisters. But from the first meeting, I noticed that she did not think well of me. She was uninterested in me. She pretended to like me when our parents were around, but ignored me when we were alone. I did not talk to my parents about this issue. I also distanced myself from her, trying not to involve her too much. As time passed, she effectively moved into my house. During those days, Dan removed his mask as a good father. I feel that he became too familiar with us, and his true self began to appear. He also seems to be taking advantage of the fact that my mother is currently abroad. My mother often stays abroad for months for her job. She recently returned to work after my father died. She took a long vacation to take care of me. She ran a small business to support us, but after remarrying, she wanted to pursue her career again. As her daughter, I am old enough to take care of myself, and she probably thought Dan would support me if I needed help. I strongly support my mother's decision, and I'm very proud of her. However, her actions seem to have triggered Dan to start abusing me. The note stated that I could only return home if I apologized to his daughter. If not, I would need to find a place to live on my own. I had lived with rude people previously, and since Dan seemed interested in learning proper manners by being in a pampered state, I intended to teach that to him. I am not sure how to deal with this yet, but I do not intend to leave. I will contact my mother to explain the situation without being kicked out of the house by a man who does not even own it. I will tell my stepsister that we will not live together, and that it is necessary for her to listen to me even just once. I do not intend to listen to her, so she should follow my instructions. What I do next will depend on how she responds. This is a choice between resolving this peacefully or having family issues. I prefer peace over harboring problems. Am I overreacting? Am I acting out of jealousy? I try to look at this issue from as many perspectives as possible. How can you justify evicting someone without notice while they are at work? Isn't that disrespectful? Isn't that an uncontrollable brazenness? The more I think about this matter, the more problems I feel. I have decided to stop being kind. I am deeply considering what actions I should take. Since this incident, I have remained calm. I am confident that the choices I have made are the most appropriate under the current circumstances. I have always tried to behave courteously, but the people I interact with do not recognize it. As soon as my mother woke up, she called to ask what had happened. I hoped she might be surprised or perhaps agree with me, but neither happened. Instead, my mother questioned where I went wrong and said she wasn't surprised by my actions because Dan had warned her about this issue beforehand. Dan had told her that I was rude, and that living together was impossible. Knowing that Dan lied to her, I was trembling with anger. I questioned my mother about what she thought of it, whether it was towards me, her daughter, or towards the man she had just married. She answered that the time spent together doesn't matter. She said she was simply thinking of everyone in her family. She had been informed in advance that Dan planned to welcome his daughter into our home. Hearing that made me feel like leaving home. But on the day Dan decided to welcome his daughter, he packed my bags, changed the locks, and kicked me out of the house. Dan and my mother were planning to replace me with his problematic daughter. I told my mother I was extremely disappointed in her decision. I criticized her for loving her new family more than me. She was clearly ready to forget her past, me, and to accept her future, which is Dan and his daughter. She tried desperately to deny it and explain, but I had no intention of listening to her words. I indicated to her that I would give her a chance to correct the situation before doing something irreversible. I also told them they had 24 hours to leave my father's house. They should never come back, and only my mother was welcome to return. She reacted angrily and even tried to shift all the blame onto me. According to her, I had become a changed and ungrateful person. She asked how much I intended to push away the people who support me. She even accused and blamed me for using drugs. Can you believe it? She was convinced that I was consuming some irrational substances. Hearing that, I could only laugh. Dan carried out his plan and succeeded in kicking me out of the house while my mother was not home. He was truly like the stepmother from a fairy tale. After the call with my mother, I started to prepare for work, but I couldn't concentrate without music. When the music stopped, the exchange with my mother wouldn't leave my mind. The thought was so strong that I began to tremble, which led to me actually experiencing a severe panic attack. I hadn't been in such a state since my father's funeral. I couldn't believe my father was dead and had days where I saw him in my dreams. At the memorial service, I saw someone who looked like him, but it turned out to be someone else. Now they are trying to pull me away from precious memories with my father who cared so much for me. That house is not theirs, and I have no intention of retracting my statement. Dan did not know that the house was in my name. You should have seen his face when I kicked him and his ignorant daughter out of the house. I felt really relieved to be able to drive them away. They revealed their true selves, and I think I handled it appropriately. Dan's plan might have looked something like this. One day, Dan met my wealthy mother. She owned a beautiful and spacious house, and my presence as her daughter could potentially be a hindrance. I had the power to easily remove him from my mother's life. I would have prevented him from transferring the house deed into his name. Therefore, he pretended to be a good person, encouraged my mother to return to work, and gained my trust. As a result, I became friendly with him. I started living with him, feeling safe, but he succeeded in driving a wedge between my mother and me. After we were divided, he used his daughter to make me feel unwelcome. He began to emotionally distance himself from me and directed his affection towards his daughter. This led to my dissatisfaction, anger, and irrational actions. He misunderstood that the house was in my mother's name, and his main goal was to drive me out because I was young. My mother only saw his kindness towards me and believed it. She deeply trusted him, even entrusting her life to him. She would quickly believe that her own daughter harbored hostility towards her stepdaughter. However, her partner was not a good person. My mother dislikes acknowledging her mistakes, and he exploited this fact to deceive her. His ultimate plan was to live in the house with his daughter while my mother was away. In a few months, he planned to have my mother transfer the deed of the house into his name. Soon, he planned to proceed with a divorce from my mother, either to acquire half of her assets, or to leave her and cash out the assets. However, there might be people who want to defend him. I need to listen to their opinions and reveal the truth. If I had allowed my stepsister to live at home, things might have been different, but she needed to be the right kind of person to live with, and she wasn't. She was very difficult to handle. When using the kitchen, she never cleaned up after herself. Money often went missing when she was in the house. She entered my room multiple times without my permission and used my belongings without asking. I always place things in specific spots, so I notice immediately if something is amiss because she touched my belongings without permission. I never intended to live with such a person again. Let's go back to what happened earlier this week. I went to gather all the necessary documents to proceed with the eviction legally. I didn't have time to play around, and I had no intention of leaving any room for them to return. It took a little time, but with the help of a friend, I was able to handle everything quickly. When everything was ready, I immediately headed home. I knocked on the door, and my stepsister opened it, but quickly tried to close it saying, "You are not welcome here." I pretended to be sad and told her I had come to apologize. She looked surprised and confused, probably because my behavior was so out of character. Then her father, Dan, appeared behind her and asked what I was doing. I told him it would take about 8 hours to move everything out of the house. He had a lot of furniture, so I was being quite generous. I showed him the court order and said, "If you don't pack up, I'll have to force you out, and everything of value that you own will be discarded. My only concern is getting you out of the house." I meant it, but he didn't seem to take my words seriously. He said I couldn't take such actions without my mother's permission. According to him, all my actions were illegal, and he intended to have me arrested. At that moment, I told him, "If you want, you can call as many times as you need." However, all they could do was mock me. Eventually, they realized the court order was genuine and understood they had no choice but to leave. As a result, I succeeded in evicting them from the house I had lived in since childhood. Still, I wanted to relax and unwind in my father's house without any disturbances. The events of the past few days had been very tough, so I needed some time to relax. My mother had been asking me to apologize to Dan and his family, but since I wouldn't do as she wished, she decided to punish me. I ignored her calls for days because I had nothing in particular to say to her. About 2 weeks later, when my mother returned home, she hit me for the first time. There was a reason for her behavior. I had scheduled a dental checkup, but after the examination, I found out I had to pay for everything myself. The dentist told me that my medical insurance was no longer valid. I was shocked by this news as I had been insured all along. After several phone calls, it became clear that my mother had removed me as a beneficiary of her medical insurance. Moreover, she had never informed me about it. It can definitely be said that she did this on purpose. I had to pay the full amount myself, which confused me greatly. I felt anger towards her treatment, but I had no intention of letting her have her way. If she wanted to talk, she should do it face to face. Afterward, I sorted out the insurance paperwork. Later on, I signed out of all the streaming subscriptions my mother was using. My mother is not very tech savvy, and I got her hooked on streaming services when she wanted to watch her favorite shows online. She had asked me to help set up her account. I wanted to save money, but considering what she had done for me, I decided to add her to my account. It could be said that we had a symbiotic relationship. However, that is a thing of the past now. Later, the streaming subscription was canceled because she failed to pay the usage fees. If I had to pay all my medical bills myself, I thought she should pay for her subscription services herself too. It's easy to imagine how upset and angry she was. I learned many important things from her. When she decided to sever all ties that connected us, I had already been maintaining a distance from her. I understand well that she had provided me with financial support in several crucial areas of my life. She did not want me to leave the house, but still, she knew how to resolve conflicts and could always find a way to make everyone happy. I think my father would not have wanted us to fight over these issues, but in the end, my mother made her choice, and it almost broke my heart. I was her precious daughter, and that's why I couldn't understand why this was happening to me. As I write this, I feel the pain in my heart. This incident was a time when my mother was wrong and one of the few moments when I was right. I can't help but think how much better it would have been if it were the other way around. I want to see what kind of price Dan will pay in the future. Understanding that I have gotten the house makes me realize I have won. At that moment, I felt like a winner, but as time passed, that feeling of victory turned into sadness. I feel incredibly lonely from the depths of my heart for not being able to see my mother. Being away from my mother for so long has become a heavy burden for me. But pride came first, and I decided to avoid contacting her. If I had reached out to her at that time, maybe she would have opened her heart to me. Perhaps I could have realized sooner that Dan was destroying my relationship with my mother. I was at the office when my mother last spoke with Dan and his family, so I don't know what was said. However, as a result, my mother ended up separating from Dan. Still, my mother and I haven't been in contact for a while, and she is also avoiding talking to me. I don't know what she is doing. The next time I learned what had happened to her was when I received a phone call from the hospital informing me that she had collapsed. My mother suddenly had a heart attack in a store. When I went to my mother's apartment to check her belongings, I found a letter my father had left for her. My mother had trusted Dan, and he had stolen everything from her. I regret it. I feel a strong want to call my father and apologize if I could. I believe I should have done more research on Dan before he put a ring on my mother's finger. I really regret a lot of things. Have you ever taken a bold decision that fundamentally altered your course in life? I am concentrating on my mother's recuperation and providing her with the best assistance I can, but I wasn't sure if I should notify everyone. Nevertheless, I believe it is my duty to let you all know about this tragedy. As you might guess, I was really unhappy with the situation, as was my mother. We felt as though the entire world had deceived us, and we were overcome with despair and rage. But I concentrated on taking care of my mom and restoring our relationship's trust. Dan is no longer alive, and the cops are currently holding his daughter. That's because someone killed Dan. His daughter was brought into custody as a witness when someone informed the police about it. I intend to pay her a visit as soon as I can. I want to see if she has regret after what she did by looking into her eyes. If not, I might believe that she ought to have suffered the same fate as Dan. First and foremost, I would like to thank everyone who helped me through this trying period. Thankfully, my mother has made a full recovery. Actually, my mother has experienced heart attacks before. I thought I may lose her, and I was terrified. I sincerely apologize for any minor error I may have made in relation to Dan's romance hoax. Verification and investigation are crucial, and one shouldn't make snap judgments. My father had, at least, made sure that my name appeared correctly on the title deed to the house. We had a good possibility of losing the house to them without it. I also reiterated the importance of exercising caution while inviting someone into one's house. The rationale is that the individual might not be who you believe them to be. Thankfully, we succeeded in getting a favorable result. Even still, hearing about others who are in worse circumstances than we are still very painful to me.